Welcome to La Chaga Family Coaching, and in today's episode we're going to be talking about children who leave the church. There's an increasing number of millennials specifically who have decided to become unaffiliated to religion, and we see that in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints that this trend is also happening and occurring, and this causes a lot of heartbreak and difficulties for parents who want their kids to stay grounded in their beliefs and in their homes. And so we're going to talk a little bit about what is kind of going on with this. Why is it that millennials are leaving their religions and becoming unaffiliated? And what are some things that parents can do to help their kids when this happens? So before we begin, have you ever heard of anything called snowplow parenting?
The recent college admissions bribery scandal putting a spotlight on what's known as snowplow parenting.
Parents clearing away all obstacles so kids never have to deal with failure, but it can have disastrous results.
Now, snowplow parenting, that's when parents try to make sure that their kids are successful by overstepping their bounds a little bit. I remember hearing a news report about a parent who would call their kid every morning to make sure that they had gotten up to go to school, to go to college. And I remember hearing about how parents would make sure that their kids had the right diet at college, those types of things. All these things are just parents who are going to the extreme with regards to their kids and not letting their kids figure out things on their own. Now, most parents are not snowplow parents, but I think this pattern sometimes of parents either avoiding or going to too much extent with regards to controlling their kids sometimes is the same pattern that kind of leads to kids leaving the church or leaving their religion to some extent. So, for example, I think that parents many times want to keep their kids within their religion, and so they'll make sure they have them get up in the morning for school, for church, or for make sure that they're reading their scriptures, but don't really explain to them why we do these things. And this sometimes can lead to doubts for kids, or especially as they grow up, or not really having that foundation of why they go to church or why they're doing it. It also doesn't help them to create values and help them to understand what their own beliefs are. And this is uncomfortable for parents because there's a risk of doing that. It could mean that their kids will change their values or will want to seek out different values. That's scary. So stick with the institution. Just stick with what you're supposed to do and kind of enforce that. And that's what parents do. I think that it's a more comfortable approach for parents in many ways. But also, I think this is causing some kids difficulties with really understanding their own religion. We're going to talk more about that in depth in just a few minutes here. Before we begin, I think there's a definition we need to clarify. It's this definition of what we call religious nons. This is what researchers have said are individuals who have no religious denomination or religious affiliation. And so in the world today, we are seeing that there is an increase in the amount of religious nons in every generation, but especially for millennials. So, for example, I'm looking at some stats here from Pew Research, which says in 2014, there has been 36% of millennials are now religious nons. Older millennials, there's 34%. Generation X, 23%. Baby boomers, 17%. And silent generation, 11%. And so we can see that with millennials, it's the highest. Young millennials being the highest, 36%. And we'll probably see the same in the next generation, probably an increase because that's the trend we've been seeing. This is evident by some research that Ryan Berg has interpreted from I think he took this from the General Social Survey, but in 2016, 21.6% of generations in total were religious nons, and that went up to 23.1% in 2018. And so we're seeing an increase in the amount of religious nons in the world as time goes on. Now, in Pew Research again, as they've taken Mormons into consideration, or the members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, we see that in general in 2007, 70% there was a 70% retention rate of members of the church. And then in 2014, that dropped to 64% retention rate. And among millennials, it was 62%. And actually, the Pew Research has the most positive number of this. If we take another research, which is the General Social Survey, they suggest that our retention rate is actually 46%. So quite a bit lower. It's hard to say what is true in this and which one is the most correct number. There is a researcher named Jana Reese who wrote The Next Mormon, How Millennials Are Changing the LDS Church. And she also did her own study with her own survey. And she suggests that the numbers are probably pretty close to what the General Social Survey has reported. And so it's a fairly low retention rate of around 46%, maybe a little bit higher. And so that's kind of what we're seeing within the church and within outside of the church with regards to millennials. And so it's pretty indicative of what's going on. I think that within the church, we have possibly a little bit higher a rate than maybe the nation as a whole, but it's still fairly low, and it's disappointing and troublesome to many parents, because parents are seeing this in their own lives. They're seeing that millennials have been, leaving the church or leaving their religion. And again, this causes a great deal of pain for many parents out there. And so they are, I think, rightfully concerned about this, especially if they would like their children to stay within the church and really wants them to continue within their faith that they've promoted to them. Let's dive into this research a little bit more and try to understand, what is this data telling us? Is it that millennials in the church just no longer are believers, or do they just not want to be part of a religion? So Jana Reese from the Next Mormon Survey suggests that these results don't necessarily mean that Mormon millennials are not believers. In fact, actually, she broke down her research a little bit more, and one of the questions she asked was, do individuals believe that Jesus Christ was literally resurrected? And 9 out of 10 individuals affirmed in some form or another that this is a belief they had. Now, the difference is that millennials are becoming more and more uncertain about this, but they do not totally say, no, that is not true. They just have some doubts. But in some form or another, 9 out of 10 have suggested that this is true. And so that's a good indicator that millennials aren't necessarily becoming unbelievers. They're just more unsure, which is interesting, because I feel like this is a good thing for millennials and is indicative of what millennials are doing today. How they are being more cautious and questioning more. Now, this is hard for parents, because parents don't like it when their kids question them. There is, rightfully so, some concern about this for when parents see that their kids are questioning them or questioning their beliefs, because it causes anxiety and a lot of uncomfort for parents when they see their kids do this. But this is actually a good thing about millennials, and we're going to talk about why that is true in just a moment here. But we can see that something else that Jana Reese has stated is that this is a generation that does not want to be judged harshly themselves and seems careful about not judging others in turn. And again, this is evident that we see millennials, they don't want to necessarily judge individuals, and they don't want to judge others, and they don't want themselves to be judged. Because they want to be cautious. They want to ask questions. They want to try to gain the full picture, I think, in many instances. Now, because of this, sometimes there's some stereotypes that we have put onto millennials or younger generations about being lazy, or I I don't know, lots of different types of stereotypes. And this has kind of caused a problem because, again, when we do these stereotypes to individuals, we are in effect judging them. And as we've just learned, millennials don't like to be judged, and they don't like to judge others. They like to be able to find their own path. I think that the church is starting to realize this a little bit more too, and has taken some actions to help to reduce this, because within the church, unfortunately, we do have a culture of judgment at times. And I think this is something that we are constantly trying to evolve and fix within our congregations. But we judge each other. We do it subconsciously. I don't even think we're really thinking about it sometimes. We go to church and we see perfect people. They're all dressed in their Sunday best. And so what we see is just people who are perfect, who are, kids are coloring in their coloring books all nice and quietly. And then we look at our kids, and our kids are hanging possibly from a chandelier somewhere. And we're just like, how in the naturally start to judge ourselves and others by kind of these appearances. Another way that judgment sometimes occurs is, like, for example, if an individual comes home from their mission early, or just decides not to go on a mission. Maybe here's a big one too for young single adults who may not get married as soon as some people think that they should. These are just examples of how sometimes we judge each other, and especially the younger generation. And this is hard for them. They don't like this. And I think it is partially why we're seeing a greater influx of millennials leaving the church, because of these institutions which they are struggling to fit into, or feeling judged within. And sometimes I think institutions can do that. We're all having to see that there needs to be some sort of change or adaptation to this. And again, I think what we are seeing this within our own religion. Neil L. Anderson had a talk within the Ensign in just recently in 2019 that said, let us not be self-righteous. He's talking about ministering in a holy way. And one of the disclaimers he gave is we need to make sure that we're not being self-righteous, which I think means judging people. President Nelson, in a talk that he gave in 2016, which said, many people refer to you as millennials. I'll admit that when research refer to you by that word and describe describe what their studies reveal about you, your likes and dislikes, your feelings and inclinations, your strengths and weaknesses, I am uncomfortable. There is something about the way they use the term millennial that bothers me. And frankly, I'm less interested in what the experts have to say about you than what the Lord has told me about you. Again, so we can kind of see how even within the President Nelson and Elder Anderson, how they are trying to adapt the approach so that they can show that we're not trying to judge you. We love you. We want you to see that we want to listen to you and we want to answer your questions, that sort of thing. We see that as members of the apostles and the first presidency have had question and answer type series and wanted them to ask questions. These are all new ways of doing things, and I think a lot of it is to adapt to the way millennials are how they see the world and how they are trying to learn from the world. An article where a bishop named Richard Ostler, a former YSA bishop, was interviewed. He said he had something interesting to say. Bishop Ostler said, millennials are wired to see the world the way Christ does. They see him in the scriptures helping all those on the margins. They think, how can our gospel or church first reach the people on the margins, those with tattoos or the divorced or people of other races, etc. They say he would see them first and want to make them feel welcomed. And so sometimes, again, I think that we feel threatened by this way of thinking. We think it's different. We think it shouldn't be that way. But in reality, I think this way of thinking is changing our culture for the better. And millennials are driving this, I think. Now, it's not to say that millennials don't have their weaknesses, because they do. I'm a millennial. I know I have that. But I think as well, we're seeing that millennials are driving the church in a good place where we are reaching out to the margins more. And a lot of this comes from this ability for millennials not to judge as harshly as maybe we have had in the past. We are accepting of more individuals and helping them to come unto Christ. So this is a good thing. But again, it takes us, especially for parents, they will need to adapt a little bit how they think and do things to be able to help their kids to hopefully stay in the church or retain their membership within the church. And like I said before, this is not unique just to our religion. Multiple religions are struggling with this very principle, and they are also trying to find ways to adapt so that they can help their younger members to stay within their religions and within their beliefs. And I might say this wrong. I believe it's the Jaina religion, but they had a conference, a biannual convention in Ontario, California, over the 4th of July weekend, and they were interviewing some of the members. And there was a member, I believe his name is, I'm going to say this wrong, Arpit Mehta, who's 33 years old and a board member of the, I guess it's the youth of Jaina. And he had to say this about of kind of his generation and what's been going on. He says, the older generation is more about practicing in the form of going to the temple, rituals, and stuff. The youth have taken a step forward. They're trying to learn more about the core values. They have been taking those core values into their non-Jaina communities. They will show up to Mahatma Gandhi Day. They will show up for non-violence days. They will do beach cleanups. They will do Save the Turtles. They will be involved in recycling projects. This is really interesting because it's true. I think millennials have kind of pulled away from institutions and more are focused on their core values. And this goes back to this idea that Jana Reese talks about, how it doesn't necessarily mean that millennials are non-believers. It's just that they are more focused on other things than just the institution. In the past, we might have defined ourselves as Buddhists or Catholics or Protestants or whatever, or Mormons, right? And instead, what millennials kind of like to focus on is, instead of that, on what they believe. So if you were to ask somebody, a millennial, what's your religion, they would more likely explain what their beliefs are, their values are. So they might say, I'm a good person, or I don't want to hurt other people. I like to be involved in my community. They would more likely share their beliefs and values rather than what the institution they are affiliated with is. And so I find that also interesting and also a valuable thing about millennials, and something that I think that in the gospel of Jesus Christ we try to talk about all the time, about what our values are and what attributes we're working on, instead of just necessarily saying, I'm a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Again, I think this is a place where millennials are driving us forward and helping us to grow even further in our beliefs, and I think driving our church in the right direction and following Jesus Christ. So let's kind of change gears here a little bit, and let's talk about how we can help this rising generation, so that we can help them in their beliefs and help them hopefully stay within the church and not necessarily feel like they have to leave the church. What are some things that we can do? Something that Jana Reese said as well in her book and in her research is that millennials who leave the church have already had doubts. So when she was looking at her research, she noticed that millennials who have been leaving the church had already had some sort of doubts already into play. So if they had these doubts and they've left the church, I wonder if in many cases it's because they felt like they couldn't talk about these doubts, or maybe their parents weren't open enough to allow them to talk about these things with them when they had doubts, because it's uncomfortable, right? Parents don't like it when their kids question them or sometimes don't have the right answers, and so it's uncomfortable. And so I kind of wonder if this is part of the problem. I wonder if it's because we're not really good at helping millennials express their doubts or to have questions. And so one of the things that I think could help parents is if they can learn to talk with their kids from a non-judgmental stance. This is a difficult skill to do. I struggle with this. It's not easy for me to do, but I think if parents can learn this skill, it will help them not just with their kids, but in all sorts of places in their lives. There was a quote by a lady named Tara Brach. I think she's a PhD clinical psychologist. She says as well, I often tell the story of a person walking in the woods and coming upon a little dog. The dog seems harmless enough, but when they reach out to pet the dog, it growls and lunges at them. The immediate response is fear and anger, but then they notice that the dog has its leg caught in a trap, and compassion begins to rise up in the place of anger. Once we see how our own leg is in the trap and hold our experience with self-compassion, it becomes easier to see how others might be caught too, causing suffering, because they are suffering. One misunderstanding is that acceptance and compassion amount to condoning, complacency, or resignation. On the contrary, true acceptance is a courageous willingness and face reality as it is right now, and compassion brings tenderness to the life of the moment. Only with this radically allowing and tender presence can we respond from our full intelligence and heart. The answer here is empathy, is to learn how to have empathy. And to do that, we have to take ourselves out of the moment and put ourselves into other people's shoes. And I think that's kind of what this example of the dog illustrates here, is that if we only see it from one perspective, then we will have judgment that may not necessarily fit with the whole worldview. So what we can do is, if we have empathy, we'll have more perspectives that will help us to make better decisions or have better judgment on the situation. And I think this would help our children as well, if we can learn how to come from it from this point of view, from an empathetic view, which again is not something that comes naturally. It's a challenge, but it's something that can happen. Brene Brown, who is a famous researcher as well, has spoke at length about empathy and the importance of it. She also talks a little bit about how to do this more often, and this is, I think, a skill that can be learned to help support our kids, is by learning the skill of empathy. Another form of empathy, the Dalai Lama said this: people take different roads seeking fulfillment and happiness. Just because they're not on your road doesn't mean they've gotten lost. Now this is hard, because I think we get caught in this trap often when we talk about the different roads. If we don't feel like somebody is on our road, then they must be lost. It reminds me of the apostles. The apostles went to Jesus Christ and said, hey, there's this guy. We don't know who he is, but he's doing miracles and doing all these things. Should we go reprimand him? And Christ said, is he doing good? And they're like, well, yeah. And he's like, well, just leave him alone. Well, he's doing his thing. Don't bother him. It's interesting that sometimes if we feel like they're not on our path, that they're on the wrong path. And I just don't know that that's necessarily true. And this is hard, especially within the church, I think sometimes. But we have to realize that everybody takes their own path, and everybody will discover their own way. And it gives me hope to know that Christ knows all of these things and will help them to gain that exaltation. And I don't necessarily have to worry about that as much as I just need to be a good example, or just be empathetic and try to understand their point of view, and then influence them for the good that I have, right? So something to think about with this as well. I think as we kind of suspend judgment, is to realize that our path is not always necessarily the right path or the wrong path. I think there could be many paths that we can take. The last thing that I think was interesting, this came from Elder Anderson, again, from his talk, Ministering in a Holier Way. But he talks about setting an example. Specifically, he talks about how others have set an example for him. He says, during my undergraduate days at BYU, other than my wife, Kathy, whose internal influence is impossible to measure, Two roommates, one before my mission and one after, greatly shaped my spiritual foundation. One was Reed Robinson, now a professor at BYU in organizational behavior. I met him on my mission, and we were roommates afterwards. Reed's exactness in following the commandments, his love for the prophets, and his unwavering testimony of the Savior strengthened me and all those around him, and he has continued to be an example to me for the past 45 years. The other roommate I mentioned is Terrell Bird, who now lives in St. George, Utah. I met Terrell as we attended high school together in Pocatello, Idaho. Although we played basketball together, our friendship came as I observed his spiritual maturity. He would openly share spiritual insights he was having and principles of life he was reading about and learning. I was surprised to hear these things from a 17-year-old. We decided to room together at BYU. In those days, we didn't have computers, we had typewriters. Terrell would take scriptures that were meaningful to him and quotations that instilled character, type them, and then store them in a small box so he could draw from them frequently. It was not uncommon for him to have more than 1,000 scriptures and quotations, many of which he would memorize. Although I was working cleaning the library every morning from 4 to 7 and carrying a full load of classes, and watching Terrell, I began to build my own file box. Terrell helped me put into my mind as a freshman at BYU words of scriptures and words of wisdom that have influenced me all of my life. I thank Reed Robinson and Terrell Bird for caring about my spirituality at a time when it made a difference. So again, I think another type of thing that can help with regards to millennials is setting an example. Setting boundaries that are examples. And again, it's not to impose or force individuals to be on our road, but to set an example of what our road looks like and why it's valuable, and allowing millennials to pick from those values things that they also see valuable. Because remember, millennials a lot of times define themselves by their beliefs and their values and what they see as important. And so again, this is another example of something that we can do. So I think that empathy is a huge thing, and approaching it from a non-judgment standpoint and just being curious and just ask questions and try to understand a point of view. And then that aspect of an example, I think, can be extremely helpful. Elder Anderson gives other examples of things that we can do in ministering in a holier way, and I think that can also be helpful if you'd like to look up that Ensign article as well, and I'll leave a link to it in this video. Jana Reese has also given some other indicators of things that helps millennials stay within the church, things that research has shown has helped them. Now again, not all of these are going to help an individual, but what Jana Reese has seen is that if multiple of these things are in somebody's life, then their likelihood of staying within the church grows. So one of these examples is being raised in a home with religious beliefs, individuals who have a connection to God, which means that they pray and they feel like they can connect to Him. This one's an interesting one. Higher education. This is interesting because many people believe that education is what causes millennials to leave the church. But research is showing that that's not the case, especially for members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. That if they have a higher education, they are more likely to stay within the church. So if you want your kids to stay in the church, promote that higher education and going to college. It will help them. Another is seminary attendance, and then also millennials who have social networks that are also within their beliefs and religion. So these are some things that you can keep in mind as you are helping your kids and influencing them and supporting them and encouraging them to participate in some of these activities. So again, within this discussion, we've talked a lot about what the research has shown with regards to millennials who have been leaving the church, and we've hopefully explained a little bit about why this may be happening. And then we've also kind of given you some ideas of how you might support your millennials in staying within the church and things that we need to do or can do to change so that we can help these individuals do so. If you have more questions or concerns, feel free to come and talk with me. Set up a one-on-one coaching session with me. That can be super helpful if you are struggling with ideas of how to be empathetic or non-judgmental, or an example. We can talk about it. I can help coach you through it. So use me as a resource. I'm here to help you be more successful with your kids, and I have experience through coaching you through that. There's also other resources, and I will leave a list of those below. One is, if you wanted to know more about the research, I would highly suggest Jana Reese's book, The Next Mormon: How Millennials Are Changing the LDS Church, which has great information. I will also leave links of other articles that I have researched and used in this research that I've given to you today that were helpful to me. So hopefully this is helpful, and I hope to see you in our next episode.